Hello, welcome to Washington Talk. I'm Connie Kim. South Korea's military released investigation results into North Korea's shooting on a South Korean guard post. It took more than 30 minutes for the South Korean military to respond after first hearing gunshots on the guard post. Meanwhile, there has been increased spotting of U.S. surveillance aircrafts flying over South Korea. We discuss these and more. Joining us today is General Vincent Brooks. General Brooks is a career Army officer who recently retired from active duty as a 4-star general. He's a former commander of the United Nations Command and U.S. Forces Korea. Scott Snyder also joins us today. He's a senior fellow for Korea Studies and director of the program on U.S. Korea policy at the Council on Foreign Relations. His book, South Korea at the Crossroads, examines the trajectory of 50 years of South Korean foreign policy and offers predictions. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Connie.
Thank you, Connie.
Now, General Brooks, I want to start off with you. Thank you for joining us all the way from Texas, first of all. According to the South Korean military, it says it took 32 minutes for them to respond back to North Korea's GP shooting. And one of the reasons it couldn't respond immediately was because of a gun malfunction. How did you assess South Korea's overall response measures?
Well, it's an interesting question. This is why investigations are done, and no doubt there'll be several investigations that are done. The South Korean military will want to investigate whether indeed there was some sort of weapons malfunction that would have prohibited their response. I do think that it's also a function of looking at exactly what were the weather conditions at the time. If indeed the clouds were very thick that day and they couldn't tell whether they had or hadn't received gunfire until they inspected their local area and found, as they reported, 4 bullet holes, they probably didn't even realize something had happened. So the 30-minute separation is explainable in that regard, but the nature of the response leaves another question that the South Korean military and the UN command will have to examine.
But Mr. Snyder, on the other hand, there are some criticism that South Korea's response was too late. How did you assess their response measures?
Well, for this sort of incident, regardless of intent, whether it was accidental or intentional, it does constitute a test of readiness. You know, this particular incident has pointed out some issues that the South Korean Ministry of Defense appears to be recognizing and trying to deal with in terms of making sure that the guns are operational in that area. So in that sense, there is an after-action review, and there are lessons that are being learned. I think that actually is a silver lining and a positive outcome.
General Brooks, you mentioned the importance of investigations, and the UN command did launch investigations into this incident, but they weren't able to investigate the North Korean authorities, as they have not responded to investigation requests. So, as a former UN command commander, what can be done in order to get a thorough investigation into these incidents?
Well, since the North Koreans walked away from the armistice agreement and the structure associated with the Military Armistice Commission, it is difficult, if not impossible, to get clarity on anything that is initiated by the North Korean side. The South Korean side and the United Nations Command will do their best to determine from any forensics that are available there. And if they indeed believe that there's North Korean activity involved in this, then they will register a complaint through Panmunjom, through the communication mechanisms that already exist, and may even call for a meeting to prevent this sort of thing from happening again. But it's very likely that North Korea will not be transparent on what happened. If it was an accident, they're likely to be embarrassed and they won't acknowledge that. If it was intentional, they won't describe what their intentions were. Either case, I think, is a concern because it will always be difficult to find out what really North Korea was up to.
And there's been increased spotting of U.S. surveillance aircrafts flying over South Korea. What are the purposes of these flights? Are they part of their routine flights, or is it something out of the ordinary that we should take a look at?
These are not unusual flights. Reconnaissance aircraft fly multiple times every day, and there are different types of aircraft that fly. And their purpose is simply to keep an eye on North Korea's military disposition. That includes some of its installations and facilities. It includes forward positions, all these things that would indicate whether or not something has changed in the security calculations there. So I don't find anything surprising about this. They aren't hiding. These are all flown in South Korean airspace or in international airspace that provide a look into North Korea.
Yeah, and maybe what I could add is that these sorts of reconnaissance flights provide evidence that North Korea remains a high intelligence priority for the United States, and that efforts to gain information about North Korea remain well resourced within the intelligence community budget.
So General Brooks, you did mention that they fly multiple times over South Korea. This is nothing unusual, but the reason why these surveillance aircrafts are being spotted is because they fly with these transponders on, knowing that they will be spotted. So is there some kind of intent behind this? Is there some kind of message they want to send to North Korea?
No, it's a matter of transparency, honestly. If they wanted to conduct an operation where they were more deceptive and were not able to be observed, then they would do that. And so having the transponders on is a matter of transparency. There are flights that happen every day. It's not a secret. North Korea knows about these flights. And sometimes it's very important when there's the intention of collecting information, but not the intention of provoking, to be as transparent as possible so that there's not a miscalculation by South Korea or North Korea. And by the way, South Korea flies many of these reconnaissance missions themselves.
Mr. Snyder, but didn't we see these increased spottings of surveillance aircraft activities, especially when there were tensions risen on the Korean Peninsula?
Well, certainly there were, I guess, publicized reconnaissance flights that were conducted in coordination with rising tensions in 2017. It seems that there was an effort to, signal deterrence of North Korean missile development efforts. But at this point, I would say that we're in a regime where that appears to have been relaxed, along with the revised exercise regime. And it is important for North Korea to know that the U.S. And South Korea are still watching what is happening closely. But overall, I would say that the environment is certainly less tense than it was in 2017.
And General Brooks, you did mention that these surveillance aircrafts all have different functions, but the surveillance aircrafts that flew over South Korea, they collect signals intelligence and electronic intelligence data before North Korea's missile launches. So how are these information gathered, used in order to get an idea of what's happening inside North Korea?
Well, North Korea knows that it does denial and deception and does it very well. And so different systems are required to create a fuller picture. This is important so that there's not a misunderstanding on the part of the Korea-U.S. alliance also. So if there's any kind of North Korean activity, the South Korean and American sides need to understand what's going on as quickly as possible.
And Mr. Snyder, as a North Korea watcher, what are some of the things that we should be looking at politically and socially while we looked at some military aspects?
Well, the main area, I think, of focus right now that is of immediate concern is related to whether or not North Korea is facing a hard currency crisis in the context of facing both the externally imposed pressures related to sanctions and the internally imposed challenges related to quarantine. And I think that this actually might be the most serious challenge that the North Korean leadership is facing at this moment. And so we have to watch carefully whether or not there are additional evidences of distress or potential emerging economic instability in North Korea associated with the evidence of hard currency crisis.
And North Korea has always responded very sensitively to the U.S. ROK military exercises. Now, the military exercise in February has been postponed due to the pandemic, and a lot of these joint exercises have been scaled back to support diplomacy. There have been continued concerns of whether this is going to impact the readiness level. General Brooks, is this concerning for you?
Well, certainly, anytime readiness is eroded, that's always a concern. I would tell you that military commanders are paid to find creative ways to maintain readiness. I have no doubt that General Abrams and his counterparts on the South Korean side are all doing what they can to maintain whatever readiness they can. So I say that to make it clear that there's not this gross erosion of military capability. There are minor losses in military capability, and sometimes those can be restored by other events and activities. This is a command post exercise, for example, and it exercises some of the decision-making processes, some of the interfaces with higher levels of government in the US and South Korea. The coronavirus also demanded that. So the coronavirus was a training event for the command and control of the combined forces. And I know that that was used. I certainly would have used it as a training opportunity as well. So we have to look at readiness in a different way. I think it's important for North Korea to not misunderstand this, that exercises by professional militaries, like as they do, are about maintaining the capability for which they exist.
The challenge of the pandemic itself provided opportunities to test coordination between USFK and South Korean government authorities. And so in that respect, it has been an important opportunity to learn additional lessons and to enhance coordination.
And before we go, I want to briefly touch upon the ongoing military burden sharing cost negotiations. It's been reported that South Korea offered 13% increase from the previous year, and the US has offered a 49% increase from the previous agreement. So it seems like the two sides are still wide apart, and there are concerns that this may drag out until the US presidential elections. Do you share the same concern?
We are at an interesting juncture in terms of this particular negotiation. In order for the gap to be closed, I think that we're going to have to use a strategy that is not focused solely on transactionalism. If South Korea is going to meet U.S. expectations for paying more in terms of its share of the burden, it's going to be necessary to frame that additional burden in terms of enduring alliance relationship, not in terms of whether or not South Korea is a free rider. Otherwise, politically, I think that the likelihood of being able to reach a mutually acceptable agreement is going to be lower, and the transactional approach is going to be self-defeating.
And I certainly agree with Scott's view on this. I'm very concerned about the transactional approach and the fundamentally nationalistic approach being taken by both governments. Alliances fundamentally require a subordination of national self-interest in exchange for collective interest. And this has been reversed in recent years. I just hope that the two governments don't lose sight of those deep core matters of the Korea-US alliance. I don't think that the alliance is coming apart here by any means. I believe that this approach to making an agreement is what is at stake. The alliance has been through numerous challenges and has had frustrations like any relationship would, and they always stick together. So I'm confident that they'll work their way through this, but it does have potential to be protracted for a longer period of time, with the three elections really being the relevant ones: the most recent general election for the Korean National Assembly, the upcoming U.S. General election that will include election for the President of the United States, and then in 2022, the elections for general elections in South Korea that will include electing the President of the Republic of Korea. All of these are factors now because of the political nature of what had previously been fundamentally a military support agreement. And it now is a much more politicized decision.
And a lot of experts have said that this situation where there's a current row between the US and South Korea on the military burden sharing costs is something that North Korea is likely to welcome. So we definitely hope to see a compromise between the two sides that will benefit both sides as well. Thank you so much, General Brooks and Mr. Snyder, for joining us today.
Thank you, Connie.
Thank you. That does it from all of us here at VOA's Washington Talk. Thank you for joining. Join us again next week. Goodbye.